David Barsamian joins us now in the studio. Good morning, David.
Good morning, Sam, and we're really honored today at KJNU Boulder, Denver, to have one of India's premier journalists. His name is P. Sainath. He's the rural affairs editor and award-winning journalist for The Hindu in Mumbai. He's also the author of Everybody Loves a Good Drought, Stories from India's Poorest District, a bestseller in India, and he's won numerous awards. Welcome to KJNU.
Thank you. My pleasure, David.
While we were listening to the BBC headlines a few moments ago, you reminded me of something one of the leaders of the Indian independence movement, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, said about the BBC. What did he say?
Well, actually, he called it the Bluff and Bluster Corporation. Because that was a time when it was in conflict with the Indian freedom struggle, where it showed no pretense of objectivity or neutrality or anything of the sort. So he just dismissed it in those words.
9/11 has taken on iconic status here in the United States. It is a mantra that is constantly intoned by the pundits during daily newscast pujas and the like. But there was an article you wrote recently about another September 11th that kind of slipped under the media radar screen. It took place in South Africa. Talk about that.
September 11, 2006 was the 100th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha, the first time he inaugurated the principle of non-violent protest against the South African government of the time and its racist policies. So, in fact, there were three 9/11s. One was September 11, 1973 in Chile, 2001 over here. But the difference is that Gandhi's 9/11 actually worked. It took the world forward, not backwards. It actually created an opportunity for people to protest, and it shook an empire eventually. So, in that sense, the 9/11 of 2006, of 1906, was a very, very different kind. It was about uniting people rather than dividing them. Unlike the world we live in, where the Muslim, non-Muslim divide is growing by the day, 1906 9/11 was the first time the Hindus and Muslims of Indian origin in South Africa came together to challenge an empire and its iniquity.
And it was in South Africa that the British-trained barrister Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi made his name, and then he went to India.
Yes, this happened with a meeting of 3,000 people in Johannesburg, many of whom were quite mystified by the new doctrine that he was propounding, that we can resist without violence. He did not see that as being passive at all. He saw that as being the outcome of the situation that they were in, and felt it was the best weapon that he could use.
9/11 has also had a huge impact on security at U.S. airports. You travel...
Tell me about it.
I want to ask you about it. What are your experiences?
Well, in the last 2 or 3 trips I've made to the U.S., if I have flown 25 times, I am a random selectee on 23 of those 25 times. You know, so you're going through and they say, you're selected, sir, for today you're selected for additional screening. And you go through the same thing every time. It doesn't mean much. I don't lock my bags either, but even those go through additional screening. It's fun. Because the idea somehow is that you're showing your public that you're taking additional precautions. I don't think that translates into security at all, but obviously they do.
Most people don't think of India as having one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, but in fact it does, much more than, say, Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Iran or any of those countries. What is the status of, is it something like 150 million Muslims?
Well over 120 million. I mean, if you take them as 12% of the population. In fact, that's the second biggest Muslim nation in the world after Indonesia. India, by the way, is the only place in the world where you can call 100 million people a minority. But that's part of being India. Yeah, that they're very much a part of the Indian political mainstream. If you look at the entire Indian political process since we started having elections in independent India, the over 100 million Muslims have never voted more than 2 people into a parliament of 500 on anything approaching a religious plank. They've been with the mainstream political parties by and large.
And India traditionally, particularly with Pandit Nehru, who was the first prime minister of independent India after 1947, carved out a niche in the third world. It was a leader of the Bandung movement of independent foreign policy. Critics are now suggesting that is undergoing a transformation under Manmohan Singh, that they're coming closer to the Bush administration line on international issues.
I think it has undergone that transition and transformation, and that's been happening for about 15 years. I think India has quite cheerfully abandoned its mantle of leadership of the non-aligned movement. And, in fact, it's an embarrassment to be a big leader over there at a time when your policy is so closely aligned to that of the world's biggest superpower. So, yes, the transformation, I wouldn't put it down to Manmohan Singh, but it's been happening for 10, 15 years. However, I think that this is the first time we are seeing on such a large scale a departure from India's traditional independent foreign policy moorings.
And on the U.S. attack on Iraq, initially the Indian government was well disposed to supporting it and even considered sending troops. What happened?
Oh, they came very close to it. In fact, I think that the then Deputy Prime Minister visited the United States, and from all the reports we got that he had actually promised the U.S. government that he would get on board. But there's a tremendous public resistance to any such idea in India. One, there are about 1 million Indian families that have people working in the Gulf and don't want a war, either in India or in the Gulf. Second, there is a historic memory of disasters of Indians getting involved in the wars of one empire or the other. 90,000 Indians died for British imperialism in World War I, and many more, I think, in World War II.
Many of them in Iraq itself.
A very large number of them in Iraq itself, especially in the Battle of Kut in 1916. So, yes, despite the fact that the entire national security establishment, with almost no exceptions, was crying to get on board, despite the fact that the government was so amenable to the idea, the Indian Parliament actually ended up criticizing the war. And the Indian public would not hear of it, so the idea was scuttled.
I was in New Delhi in late February of this year, just a few weeks before the arrival of George W. Bush, and I remember that people were planning large demonstrations against the arrival of the American president, and they took place.
In fact, I think it surprised people. It surprised the organizers in many cases. Some of the organizers told me that they had no clue that they would get such a big turnout. In Mumbai, the police of Mumbai ordered an investigation into their intelligence failure after they coped with what they say was the biggest demonstration they'd seen in the city in 15, 20 years. And it's a city that's seen major demonstrations by mill workers, by the Dalit organizations. And the police of Mumbai say that they had no clue that such a turnout would come. So, yes, it did happen.
You spend a lot of time in rural India, some 300 days almost, in villages. You have been writing and chronicling about an unknown crisis that's been occurring in rural India involving the deaths of tens of thousands of farmers.
We are in the midst of the greatest agrarian crisis since the eve of the Green Revolution. Millions of livelihoods are at stake. The government of India conceded in May this year on the floor of Parliament that over 100,000 farmers had committed suicide in the past decade, between 1993 and 2003. And all the evidence we have is that the intensity of these suicides has grown since then. In the region of Vidarbha, which is a region in the western state of Maharashtra, of which Mumbai is the capital, the government website will tell you there have been 900 in the past year. And in just 6 districts, India has nearly 650 districts. See, this has happened as a result of the crash and collapse of Indian agriculture under neoliberal policy. The rate of growth of food grain production is stagnant and for the first time in many, many years below the rate of growth of population. The rate of growth of employment in rural India is at its lowest since we started keeping data. Millions of people are involved in migrations away from the villages as their livelihoods collapse. And hunger is on the rise in a very major way. In fact, even 2 days ago, you had a report from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food that India added many millions of newly hungry people in the 1990s.
Now, that doesn't track with the notion of India as a bright, booming economy with Cyberabad and Bangalore and call centers and high-tech sophistication.
I'd say this. Both realities are true. The high-tech and the booming economy and the tremendous success story is definitely true of about 10% of the population. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a totally different picture, and you can see it in a very simple. Connection. India ranks number 8th in the world in the number of billionaires, but 127th in human development. So for the top 2% of the population, the benchmark is Europe and USA and Australia and Japan. For the bottom 40% of the population, the benchmark is Sub-Saharan Africa, which has generally better nutritional levels than theirs.
We just have a couple of minutes left. Explain how neoliberal economics has had this negative impact on farmers in rural areas.
Well, basically the drive seems to be that we are trying to take farming out of the hands of the largest body of small farmers in the world and hand it over to corporations. So farming is being rendered unviable by policy. In the 90s, we withdrew investment in agriculture on a scale of $7 to $8 billion a year, which translated into an income loss for the rural people of $30 to $35 billion a year. So it would have been simpler to send out the Air Force and bomb the countryside. It would have caused less lasting damage. That led to a collapse in employment, a collapse in agriculture, to mass migrations, to a total deterioration and a serious crisis in food crop. It also led, under so-called market-based pricing, to raising the costs of cultivation, sometimes in some sectors by 200 to 300%, like seeds or pesticides or fertilizers. At the same time, we got locked into the volatility of global prices, which means that our farmers were spending a lot more on cultivation but receiving a lot less for their product, thanks in some part to the obscene subsidies that the United States and the EU give their corporations. The United States has only 20,000 cotton growers, but gives them $4.7 billion in subsidies. Most of them are businesses, not small farmers.
And yesterday, after a lecture you gave at the University of Denver, one of the students came up who was from, I believe, North Dakota, and she related a story to you.
She said that she had seen some of her own relatives and uncles sell off their farms, their hogs, particularly their hogs, as the entire thing of hog farming became totally unviable. I'd seen this with my own eyes in Iowa, where a lot of hog farmers went bust in the late 90s when I was teaching there for a semester.
So this is a part of a worldwide trend where small farmers are being pushed out.
It is the worldwide assault on smallholder farming in favor of corporate farming.
What, in the minute we have left, what can people do about this here in the United States, people listening to your voice right now?
I think there are a lot of activities going on already. It's a question of whether you want to join up with them. There have been anti-corporate actions in the United States, as, for instance, the anti-Coke movement, anti-Coca-Cola movement in Kerala received a lot of support from students in the campuses of the United States who made their universities withdraw from any affiliation with Coca-Cola. There's a lot of actions going on. It's about whether you want to join them or you don't.
I'm afraid we've run out of time. I've been talking with P. Sainath. He's an independent journalist, one of the top reporters in India. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Dave.
I'm David Barsamian. Thank you for listening.